The velvet curtains had just fallen on the final act of La Boheme when Patricia Whitmore turned to her circle of friends in the Opera House's most exclusive box seats and said the words that would change everything. "You know, I still can't believe Robert married that little fortune hunter," she whispered, not bothering to lower her voice as I stood just 3 feet away, carefully folding my program. The way she clings to our family's coattails, attending every event, trying so desperately to fit into our world. It's almost pathetic, really. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood there in my carefully chosen navy dress, the one I'd saved for months to buy, watching the woman who had raised the man I loved dismiss me like yesterday's newspaper. The irony was so thick I could have conducted an orchestra with it. Below us, the stage where world-renowned performers had just brought Puccini's masterpiece to life was funded partly by the very money Patricia assumed I was trying to steal from her family. But she had no idea that the anonymous donor who had quietly established the Metropolitan Opera House's youth outreach program 3 years ago was standing right behind her, close enough to hear every venomous word. The story of how I became the woman Patricia Whitmore would eventually call a fortune hunter began in the most unlikely place imaginable, a cramped practice room at Metropolitan City Conservatory, where the heating barely worked and the piano keys stuck if you didn't hit them just right. I was 22, surviving on instant ramen and determination, teaching piano lessons to elementary school kids for $15 an hour, while completing my master's degree in music education. My grandmother's threadbare coat hung on the back of my chair, the same coat she'd worn to every one of my childhood recitals, the same coat I'd inherited, along with her unwavering belief that music could change the world. I wasn't supposed to be there that Tuesday afternoon in February. My regular student had canceled, and I should have been at home grading papers for the public school, where I substitute taught whenever they needed someone who could handle the music classes. Instead, I was working through a particularly challenging passage from Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, trying to perfect the fingering for a piece I'd been struggling with for weeks. The practice rooms at the conservatory were free for graduate students, and I took advantage of every minute I could get. That's when I heard it. Through the paper-thin walls came the sound of someone playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, but they were struggling with the same passage over and over again. The left hand wasn't quite synchronized with the right, and the emotional buildup that should have soared instead kept faltering. I found myself unconsciously tapping out the correct rhythm on my knee, humming the melodic line that would guide the problematic section. After 20 minutes of listening to the same 8 measures repeated with increasing frustration, I couldn't take it anymore. I knocked gently on the door of practice room B, the one where the struggling pianist was working. When no one answered, I pushed it open slightly and peered inside. A tall, brown-haired man in an expensive sweater sat at the piano bench, his head in his hands, surrounded by sheet music that looked like it had been through a tornado. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said softly, "but I couldn't help hearing you work on the Rachmaninoff. I know it's none of my business, but I think I might be able to help with that passage you're stuck on." He looked up with eyes the color of storm clouds, frustrated and slightly embarrassed. "I've been at this for 3 hours," he said, gesturing helplessly at the keys. "I used to play this piece in high school, but my fingers just won't remember what my brain thinks they should be doing." I stepped into the room, closing the door behind me. "Mind if I take a look?" He slid over on the bench, making room for me to sit beside him. The moment my fingers touched the keys, I felt that familiar sense of coming home, the feeling that had sustained me through years of financial struggle and uncertain futures. I played the troublesome passage slowly, emphasizing the way the left hand needed to lead slightly, how the right hand should follow like a dance partner trusting their lead. "See how the left hand creates the foundation?" I explained, playing it again. "The right hand isn't trying to dominate, it's having a conversation. Like this." I demonstrated the call and response between the hands, the way Rachmaninoff had written it as a dialogue between 2 voices rather than a competition. He tried it again, and this time the music flowed the way it was meant to. The room filled with the rich, complex harmonies that made Rachmaninoff's music so emotionally powerful. When he finished the passage and looked up at me, his face had completely transformed from frustration to wonder. "That was incredible," he said. "I'm Robert, by the way, Robert Whitmore. And you just saved me from throwing very expensive sheet music across the room." "Emma Chin," I replied, offering my hand. "And expensive sheet music deserves better treatment than that." He laughed, a genuine sound that made something warm unfold in my chest. "Are you a student here?" "Graduate student in music education," I said. "Though I spend most of my time teaching kids how to play Mary Had a Little Lamb without crying." "That sounds incredibly rewarding, actually," he said. And I was surprised to realize he meant it. "I work in my family's real estate business, but I've been trying to get back into playing. I used to be decent at it, but apparently I've forgotten more than I remembered." We talked for another hour, long past when both of us should have left. I learned that Robert had played piano through high school, had even considered majoring in music before family expectations steered him toward business. He learned that I'd grown up in a tiny apartment above my grandmother's flower shop, that I'd started playing piano on an old upright that was more percussion instrument than musical one, and that I'd worked 3 jobs to pay for my undergraduate degree. "Would you maybe want to grab coffee sometime?" he asked as we finally packed up our music. "I mean, if you're not too busy teaching future virtuosos how to master nursery rhymes." I should have said no. I should have recognized the gulf between his world and mine. Should have understood that a man who casually mentioned his family's real estate business probably lived in a different universe than someone who counted every dollar and saved for months to buy a decent winter coat. But when he smiled at me like I was the most interesting person he'd ever met, when he talked about music with the same passion that had driven me through years of struggle, I forgot about practical considerations. "I'd like that," I said. Our first date was at the Conservatory Cafe, a tiny place near the music school that served coffee in mismatched mugs and played classical music through speakers that had definitely seen better days. Robert showed up in jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent, but he seemed genuinely delighted by the quirky atmosphere. He ordered a simple black coffee while I splurged on a latte, and we talked for 4 hours about everything and nothing. I learned that he'd grown up in the Hillcrest neighborhood, in a house that had been featured in Metropolitan City's historic homes tour. His father, Richard Whitmore, had built a real estate empire that included some of the city's most prestigious developments. His mother, Patricia, served on the boards of half a dozen cultural organizations, including the Metropolitan Opera House. His sister, Vanessa, had married into the Sterling family, old money that traced back to the city's founding fathers. "It sounds like you grew up in a fairy tale," I said, stirring sugar into my coffee. "More like a very expensive cage," he replied, and there was something wistful in his voice that made me look at him more carefully. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm grateful for the opportunities I've had, but sometimes I wonder what it would have been like to choose my own path. To follow my interests instead of expectations. "What would you have chosen?" I asked. "Music," he said without hesitation. "I would have studied composition. Maybe tried to write pieces that people would actually want to hear. But that's not exactly a practical career choice when you're expected to take over a family business." I reached across the table and touched his hand. "It's not too late, You could still write music, even if it's not your primary career. Some of the most beautiful pieces in classical music were written by people who had other jobs." He turned his hand over, intertwining our fingers. "When was the last time someone told you it wasn't too late to follow your dreams?" The question hit me harder than I expected. "I don't know," I admitted. "I guess I've always been too busy trying to survive to think about dreams beyond getting through the next semester." "Well, I'm telling you now," he said. "Whatever dreams you're carrying, Emma Chen, it's not too late." That conversation at the Conservatory Cafe became the foundation of everything that followed. Robert started coming to the conservatory regularly, not just to practice, but to hear me play. He'd sit in the practice room while I worked through difficult pieces, offering encouragement and asking questions that showed he was really listening. In return, I helped him rediscover his love for music, working with him on pieces that challenged him without overwhelming him. 6 months into our relationship, Robert invited me to my first Whitmore family event, a charity gala at the Metropolitan Club. I spent my entire month's clothing budget on a black cocktail dress from a department store, praying it would be appropriate for whatever level of formal this family operated on. Robert picked me up in his BMW, and I tried not to think about how my beat-up Honda Civic would look parked next to it. The Metropolitan Club was everything I'd expected and more. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, servers in white gloves carrying silver trays of champagne. The other guests looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine about how the wealthy lived. The women wore jewelry that probably cost more than my annual salary, and the men's watches caught the light in ways that suggested serious money. "You look beautiful," Robert whispered as we walked through the entrance, and I believed him because he said it like he meant it. Patricia Whitmore was holding court near the silent auction tables, wearing a burgundy gown that fit her like it had been made specifically for her body, which, I realized later, it probably had been. She was explaining to a small group of admirers how she'd personally selected the wine for the evening's dinner, how she'd worked with the chef to create a menu that would complement the fundraiser's theme. "Mother," Robert said, approaching the group with me at his side, "I'd like you to meet Emma Chen." "Emma, this is my mother, Patricia Whitmore." Patricia extended her hand with the kind of smile that seemed warm until you looked at her eyes. "How lovely to meet you, dear. Robert has mentioned you once or twice." Once or twice. I'd been dating her son for 6 months, and she'd categorized me as worthy of being mentioned once or twice. But I smiled and shook her hand, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Whitmore. Robert has told me so much about your work with the arts community. The Opera House's youth program sounds particularly wonderful." Something flickered in Patricia's eyes, a brief moment of genuine interest. "Yes, well, we've been fortunate to have an anonymous donor who shares our vision for bringing classical music to young people. It's one of my proudest achievements, really." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral even as my heart rate quickened. The anonymous donor she was referring to was sitting in a modest apartment across town, grading papers and trying to make $15 stretch until the next piano lesson. But Patricia had no way of knowing that the young woman standing in front of her had quietly transferred her grandmother's entire inheritance to the Opera House's foundation 3 years ago. "Emma is studying music education," Robert said, his voice carrying a note of pride that made me stand a little straighter. "She is brilliant with kids, and she plays piano like you wouldn't believe." "How nice," Patricia said, but her attention was already shifting to someone else in the crowd. "Well, I hope you enjoy the evening." That was my dismissal. Polite, but definitive. I was someone who played piano nicely and worked with children, which in Patricia's world apparently qualified me for exactly 30 seconds of her time. Robert didn't seem to notice the subtle rejection, or maybe he was so accustomed to his mother's social calculations that he didn't recognize them as dismissive. The evening progressed in a blur of introductions I knew I wouldn't remember, and conversations about charity work, investment strategies, and social events that existed in a world far removed from my daily reality. I smiled and nodded and tried to ask appropriate questions, but I felt like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. "Emma teaches piano to kids at the community center," Robert would say when introducing me, and I watched people's faces politely rearrange themselves into expressions of mild interest before they moved on to more engaging topics. "How admirable," they would say, in the tone people use when discussing someone else's unremarkable hobby. But there were moments of genuine connection, too. Richard Whitmore, Robert's father, asked thoughtful questions about my teaching methods and seemed genuinely interested in my perspective on music education. Vanessa's husband, David Sterling, turned out to be a classical music enthusiast who engaged me in a passionate discussion about the differences between various recordings of Bach's Goldberg variations. "You really know your stuff," David said, sipping his wine. "Have you considered pursuing performance professionally?" "I'm more interested in teaching," I said. "There's something magical about watching a child discover they can create something beautiful with their own hands." "That's a lovely way to look at it," he said. "Though I have to say, you're underselling yourself. The way you describe musical interpretation shows real depth of understanding. It was the first time all evening that someone had suggested I might have something valuable to offer beyond basic competence. I felt myself relaxing slightly, remembering that I did have expertise, even if it wasn't the kind that impressed Patricia Whitmore. The drive home was quiet, both of us processing the evening in our own ways. Finally, Robert broke the silence. "I'm sorry about my mother," he said. "She can be a bit much when she's in hostess mode." "She seems very dedicated to her charitable work," I said diplomatically. "She is," he agreed. "Sometimes I think she cares more about the causes than the people. But her heart is in the right place." I wondered if my heart was in the right place too, sitting in a car that cost more than most people's homes, wearing a dress that had stretched my budget to its breaking point, falling in love with a man whose family operated in a world I'd never fully understand. But when Robert walked me to my apartment door and kissed me goodnight, when he said, "I'm proud to be with you, Emma. You're the most genuine person in that entire room," I decided that maybe hearts didn't need to be in the right place. Maybe they just needed to be in the same place. The months that followed established a pattern that would define our relationship for the next 3 years. Robert would invite me to family events, and I would attend armed with carefully researched conversation topics and clothes that represented significant financial sacrifice. I learned to navigate Patricia's world of charitable boards and social obligations, always conscious that I was being evaluated according to standards I didn't fully understand. But I also learned to recognize the moments when Robert's family saw glimpses of who I actually was. When Patricia mentioned struggling to find qualified music teachers for the Opera House's youth program, I quietly provided her with a list of contacts from my conservatory network. When Richard needed someone to help evaluate a property that had been used as a music venue, I spent a Saturday afternoon walking through the building with him, pointing out acoustical features and structural elements that would affect its suitability for performances. "You have a good eye for this," Richard said as we examined the building's sound system. "Have you ever considered working in arts administration?" "I hadn't really thought about it," I admitted. "Most of my focus has been on direct teaching." "You should think about it," he said. Organizations like the Opera House are always looking for people who understand both the artistic and practical sides of music programming. These conversations planted seeds that would eventually grow into something larger, but at the time they felt like small validations, evidence that I might eventually find my place in Robert's world. I started volunteering with the Opera House's education programs, helping to design curriculum for their school outreach initiatives. I used my connections in the music education community to identify talented young performers who might benefit from mentorship opportunities. The work was deeply satisfying, but it was also unpaid, which meant I had to maintain my regular teaching schedule to cover my basic expenses. I was working 60-hour weeks, teaching lessons during the day, and attending Whitmore family events in the evenings, always conscious of the financial stretch required to participate in Robert's social world. That's when I made the decision that would change everything, though I didn't understand its significance at the time. My grandmother's inheritance had been sitting in a savings account for 5 years, money I'd been too afraid to touch because it represented the only financial security I'd ever known. $25,000 felt like a fortune to someone who'd grown up counting every penny, but it also felt like a responsibility I wasn't sure how to handle. I'd been volunteering with the Opera House's youth program for 8 months, when Marcus Rivera, the development director, mentioned during a staff meeting that they were struggling to fund a new initiative. The program would provide free music lessons and performance opportunities to kids from low-income families. Exactly the kind of work that had drawn me to music education in the first place. "We need about $30,000 to launch the program properly," Marcus explained to the small group of volunteers and staff members who had gathered to discuss the proposal. "We have commitments for about $5,000, but we're still short on the seed money needed to get started." I sat in that meeting listening to Marcus describe the program's goals, remembering my own childhood, the way music had provided an escape from the financial stress that permeated every aspect of my family's life. My grandmother had scraped together money for my first piano lessons, sacrificing her own needs to give me something beautiful to focus on when life felt overwhelming. After the meeting, I approached Marcus privately. "I'd like to make a donation to the youth program," I said. $25,000. He stared at me like I'd just offered to donate a kidney. Emma, that's incredibly generous, but are you sure? That's a substantial amount. I'm sure, I said, though my voice was shaking slightly. I'd like to remain anonymous, if that's possible. Of course, he said. Anonymous donations are common in our world. May I ask what inspired such a generous gift? I thought about my grandmother, about the kids I taught at the community center who lit up when they finally mastered a difficult piece, about the transformative power of music that had shaped my entire life. I grew up poor, I said simply. Music saved me. I want to give other kids the same chance. The paperwork was surprisingly simple. I transferred my grandmother's inheritance to the Opera House Foundation, and within 6 months, the program was operational. The first group of kids started lessons that fall, 20 children from across the city who showed musical aptitude but whose families couldn't afford private instruction. I volunteered as one of the program's teachers, working with kids who reminded me of myself at their age. Eager, talented, hungry for something beautiful in their lives. Patricia Whitmore attended the program's launch event, giving a speech about the importance of arts education that was quoted in the local newspaper. She never knew that the anonymous donor she thanked in her remarks was sitting in the back of the room, watching her take credit for an initiative that had been funded by money earned one piano lesson at a time. The success of the youth program cemented my place in the Opera House's volunteer community. But it also created an odd dynamic in my relationship with Robert's family. Patricia would regularly praise the anonymous donor's generosity, speculating about their identity and motivations. She seemed to assume that their benefactor was someone from their own social circle, a wealthy patron who preferred to give quietly. Whoever they are, they understand the importance of cultivating young talent, Patricia would say at dinner parties. And I would nod along, keeping my expression neutral while my heart raced. Robert proposed to me 2 years after that first meeting in the practice room, on a Tuesday evening in November. We were at the conservatory in the same practice room where we'd met, and he'd arranged for the space to be filled with white roses and candles. I'd been working on a piece by Debussy, something light and flowing that matched the late autumn mood, when I realized he was standing in the doorway with a ring box in his hands. "Emma," he said, walking toward the piano bench where I sat, "you've changed my life in ways I never expected. You've shown me that it's possible to build something beautiful without sacrificing who you are. Will you marry me?" The ring was stunning, a vintage piece that had belonged to his grandmother, with a center stone that caught the candlelight like captured starlight. But what made me say yes wasn't the ring, or the romantic setting, or even the promise of financial security that came with joining the Whitmore family. It was the way Robert looked at me, like I was the most valuable thing in his world, like my happiness mattered more than anything else. "Yes," I said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Of course, yes." The engagement party was held at the Whitmore estate, a sprawling mansion in Hillcrest that had been in the family for 3 generations. Patricia had planned every detail, from the flowers to the menu to the guest list that included everyone who mattered in Metropolitan City's social hierarchy. I spent weeks preparing for the event, practicing conversations and researching the backgrounds of people I'd be expected to remember. The evening was a whirlwind of congratulations and well wishes, champagne toasts, and promises to stay in touch. I wore a dress that Patricia had helped me select, something more expensive than anything I'd ever owned, and I felt like I was playing a role in a production I didn't fully understand. "Emma's going to be such a wonderful addition to our family," Patricia announced during her toast, and the assembled guests applauded politely. "She brings such a fresh perspective to our little circle." Fresh perspective. I wondered what that meant in Patricia's vocabulary, whether it was a compliment or a diplomatic way of acknowledging that I was different from the other women in their social circle. But Robert squeezed my hand under the table, and I focused on his smile, on the way he seemed genuinely happy to be sharing this moment with me. The wedding planning process revealed the full extent of the gulf between my world and Robert's. Patricia had ideas about everything from the venue to the flowers to the guest list, all of which involved expenses that made my head spin. When she casually mentioned that the catering alone would cost more than my annual salary, I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to catch my breath. "I want you to have everything you deserve," Robert said when I tried to talk to him about the budget. "This is your day, Emma. Money isn't an issue." But money was an issue for me even if it wasn't for him. Every decision felt like a test of whether I could adapt to his family's expectations, whether I could transform myself into the kind of woman who belonged in their world. I found myself saying yes to things I didn't want and couldn't afford, all in the name of fitting in. The wedding itself was beautiful, held at the Metropolitan Club with 200 guests and a reception that was covered by the local society pages. I walked down the aisle in a dress that cost more than my childhood home's monthly rent, carrying flowers that had been flown in from 3 different states. The ceremony was performed by a minister who had officiated at half a dozen other high society weddings, and the reception featured music by a string quartet that regularly performed at the Opera House. But the moment that mattered most was when Robert took my hands during our vows and said, "Emma, you've taught me that the most beautiful music comes from the heart, not from technique. You've shown me that love is about seeing and celebrating who someone really is, not trying to change them into who you think they should be." I believed him completely, standing there in that beautiful dress surrounded by people who represented his world, not mine. I believed that love would be enough to bridge the gap between our backgrounds, that respect and understanding would grow naturally from the foundation we'd built together. The early months of our marriage were a honeymoon period in every sense. Robert was attentive and affectionate, interested in my work, and supportive of my continued involvement with the Opera House's education programs. We found a rhythm that seemed to work, balancing his family obligations with my teaching schedule, his business commitments with my volunteer work. But slowly, gradually, things began to shift. It started with small suggestions, comments that seemed helpful but carried implications I didn't fully understand at the time. "You might want to consider updating your wardrobe," Robert said one evening as we were getting ready for a charity auction. "Not that there's anything wrong with what you have, but these events can be pretty formal. Maybe you should think about cutting back on your teaching schedule," he suggested a few weeks later. "You're working such long hours, and it might be nice to have more time for family activities." "Patricia mentioned that the Opera House is looking for someone to help with their donor relations," he said over dinner. "It might be a good opportunity for you to get more involved in the administrative side of things." Each suggestion seemed reasonable on its surface, but collectively they pointed in a direction I wasn't sure I wanted to go. Robert wasn't asking me to change who I was, but he was asking me to change how I spent my time, how I presented myself, how I prioritized my various commitments. The changes were subtle enough that I couldn't quite put my finger on what was bothering me, but significant enough that I began to feel like I was losing pieces of myself. The turning point came during our first anniversary celebration. Robert had arranged for us to have dinner at the city's most exclusive restaurant, followed by a private performance at the Opera House. It was a beautiful evening, romantic and thoughtful, but it was also expensive in ways that made me uncomfortable. "This must have cost a fortune," I said as we sat in the Opera House's private box, watching a performance of Carmen that had been arranged just for us. "You're worth it," Robert said, kissing my temple. "Besides, it's not about the money, it's about celebrating us, celebrating what we've built together." But as I sat there watching the performance, I realized that what we'd built together wasn't quite what I'd imagined. Robert's love was generous and genuine, but it was also transformative in ways that hadn't been part of our original bargain. He loved me, but he also loved the version of me that fit into his world. The Emma who could attend charity galas and make small talk with potential donors and look comfortable in expensive clothes. The Emma who spent her Saturdays teaching piano to kids at the community center, who wore the same 3 dresses to every formal event, who counted every dollar and worried about rent money. That Emma was gradually being polished away, replaced by someone shinier and more socially acceptable. I didn't resist the transformation because I didn't fully understand it was happening. The changes were gradual, presented as opportunities rather than requirements. When the Opera House offered me a part-time position in their education department, it seemed like a natural progression from my volunteer work. When Patricia suggested I join her on the board of the Metropolitan Arts Council, it felt like recognition of my growing expertise. But each new role required more time, more energy, more focus on the world Robert's family inhabited. My private teaching schedule dwindled as I took on more responsibilities at the Opera House. The kids I'd been working with at the community center had to find other teachers, as my volunteer time became absorbed by board meetings and donor events. I was becoming the woman Robert had envisioned when he proposed, someone who could move seamlessly between his world and mine, who could represent his family's values while maintaining her own identity. But I was also becoming someone I didn't entirely recognize. Someone whose days were filled with obligations that felt important, but not necessarily meaningful. The anonymous donation that had launched the youth program became a source of both pride and frustration. I watched Patricia take credit for the program's success, speaking at conferences about the importance of arts education, while never acknowledging that the funding had come from someone outside their social circle. The kids in the program were thriving, which was what mattered most, but I began to feel like I was watching my own contribution be erased in real time. The anonymous donor continues to be one of our most valued supporters, Patricia would say during her speeches, and I would sit in the audience feeling invisible and essential at the same time. Robert knew about my donation, of course, but he didn't seem to understand why it bothered me that his mother received public recognition for work that had been funded by my grandmother's inheritance. When I tried to explain my feelings, he would remind me that anonymous donations were supposed to be anonymous, that the point was to support the cause rather than receive credit. "You're making a difference in those kids' lives," he would say. "Isn't that what matters?" He was right, of course, but he was also missing the point. The donation had been my way of honoring my grandmother's memory, of using her gift to create opportunities for other kids like me. But in Patricia's hands, it had become part of the Whitmore family's philanthropic legacy, another example of their commitment to the arts community. I found myself caught between two worlds, never quite belonging fully to either. In my old life, I'd been Emma the piano teacher, someone who understood struggle and appreciated small victories. In my new life, I was Emma Whitmore, wife of Robert, daughter-in-law of Patricia, someone who attended charity galas and served on nonprofit boards. Both versions of myself were real, but they were also incomplete. I was learning to navigate Patricia's world of social obligations and strategic philanthropy, but I was also losing touch with the direct, personal connections that had drawn me to music education in the first place. The work was important, but it was also abstract in ways that left me feeling disconnected from the impact I was trying to create. 3 years into our marriage, I realized that I'd become exactly what Robert had hoped I would become when he first brought me to meet his family. I was polished, well-connected, knowledgeable about the arts community, and capable of holding my own in any social situation. I'd learned to dress appropriately for every occasion, to make conversation with donors and board members, to represent the Whitmore family's values in public settings. But I'd also become someone who rarely played piano for pleasure, who hadn't taught a private lesson in months, who attended more fundraising events than actual performances. I was successful by any objective measure, but I was also profoundly lonely in ways I hadn't expected. The loneliness wasn't about my relationship with Robert, which remained loving and supportive. It was about the gradual erosion of my connection to the work that had given my life meaning. I was still involved in music education, but from a distance, through committees and strategic planning sessions, rather than direct teaching. I was still making a difference in young people's lives, but I was doing it through fundraising and program development, rather than sitting at a piano bench helping a child work through a difficult passage. The work was valuable, but it wasn't the same as the work that had originally called me to music education. And through it all, Patricia continued to praise the anonymous donor who had made the youth program possible, never knowing that the donor was sitting at her dinner table, nodding along with her speeches about the importance of arts education, while feeling increasingly invisible in her own life. The foundation had been laid, the investment had been made, and the promise of belonging to something larger than myself had been fulfilled. But as I sat at another charity dinner, wearing another carefully chosen dress, listening to another speech about the importance of supporting young musicians, I began to wonder if the price of belonging had been higher than I'd realized. I was about to find out exactly how high that price would be, and discover that sometimes the most devastating betrayals come not from strangers, but from the people who are supposed to love us most. The transformation began so subtly that I almost missed it entirely. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment when everything started to shift, though at the time it seemed like nothing more than an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Patricia's sitting room, where she was hosting her monthly Metropolitan Arts Council meeting. I'd been attending these meetings for 8 months, contributing ideas about community outreach and educational programming, feeling like I was finally finding my place in the Whitmore family's philanthropic world. That particular Tuesday, Patricia had invited someone new to join our discussion, Victoria Ashford arrived 15 minutes late, sweeping into the room with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd never doubted her welcome anywhere. She was everything I wasn't. Tall and willowy with platinum blonde hair that looked effortlessly perfect, wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Her handshake was firm, her smile practiced, and her voice carried the cultivated accent of someone who'd attended the right schools and grown up in the right circles. Victoria just returned from 2 years in London, Patricia explained as she settled into her chair. She was working with the Royal Opera House's development team, learning international best practices for arts funding. I thought she might have some insights to share with our little group. Victoria launched into a presentation about European approaches to arts patronage. Speaking with the authority of someone who'd seen how things were done in the world's most prestigious cultural institutions. She used terms like strategic philanthropy and cultural impact metrics, with the ease of someone who'd spent years in boardrooms where such language was standard currency. The key, she said, gesturing elegantly with her perfectly manicured hands, is to move beyond traditional donor models toward partnership structures that create sustainable funding streams. The Royal Opera House has developed relationships with corporate sponsors that go far beyond simple check writing. They're creating experiential opportunities that make donors feel like true collaborators in the artistic process. I found myself taking notes, genuinely interested in her ideas about innovative funding approaches. But I also noticed how the other women in the room were responding to Victoria's presentation. Their body language had shifted, they were leaning forward in their chairs, asking more detailed questions than they'd ever asked about my educational programming proposals. "That's fascinating," said Margaret Holloway, who served on the boards of 3 different arts organizations. "Have you given any thought to how these models might be adapted for our local context?" "Actually," Victoria said, her smile becoming more animated, "I've been having some preliminary conversations with Patricia about exactly that question. There are tremendous opportunities here in Metropolitan City, but they require a more sophisticated approach than what most organizations are currently using." I watched Patricia's face during this exchange, noticing how she nodded along with Victoria's every word, how she seemed to be hearing ideas that resonated with her own vision for the arts community. It was the same expression she wore when discussing her favorite charitable projects, the look of someone who'd found exactly what she'd been looking for. "Emma," Patricia said, turning to me with what seemed like an afterthought, "you've been working with our education programs for quite some time now. What do you think about Victoria's suggestions?" The question felt like a test, though I couldn't quite identify what was being tested. I tried to formulate a response that would show I understood the value of Victoria's ideas, while also acknowledging my own area of expertise. "I think there's definitely merit in developing more sophisticated donor relationships," I said carefully. "From an educational perspective, I'd be interested in exploring how these partnership models might create opportunities for direct engagement between supporters and the students we're trying to serve." Victoria's smile was polite but dismissive. "That's a lovely thought, but I think we have to be careful about overcomplicating the donor experience. The most successful programs I've seen maintain clear boundaries between the philanthropic and programmatic sides of the organization." Clear boundaries. I felt something tighten in my chest, a recognition that Victoria was essentially suggesting that people like me, who worked directly with students and programs, should be kept separate from the people who funded those programs. It was a subtle way of creating hierarchy, of suggesting that some kinds of contributions were more valuable than others. "Of course," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "I just think there's value in helping donors understand the direct impact of their support." "Absolutely," Victoria agreed, in a tone that suggested she was being generous by acknowledging my point. "Impact measurement is crucial, but it needs to be presented in ways that sophisticated donors can easily understand and quantify." The meeting continued for another hour, with Victoria outlining her vision for transforming Metropolitan City's arts funding landscape. She spoke about the need for professional development infrastructure and strategic positioning that would attract serious philanthropic investment. Every phrase seemed designed to suggest that the current approach, the one I'd been part of building, was somehow amateur or inadequate. As the other women began to leave, I noticed how they lingered around Victoria, exchanging business cards and making plans for follow-up conversations. She was clearly someone they wanted to know, someone who represented access to opportunities and connections they hadn't previously considered. "Emma," Patricia said as I was gathering my papers, "could you stay for just a moment? I'd like to discuss something with you." I settled back into my chair, assuming she wanted to debrief about the meeting or discuss some aspect of Victoria's presentation. Instead, she walked to the window overlooking her perfectly manicured garden, her expression thoughtful in a way that made me slightly nervous. "I've been thinking about your role with the Arts Council," she said without turning around. "You've done wonderful work with the educational programming, and I don't want you to think that isn't appreciated. But I'm wondering if we might be underutilizing your talents." "How do you mean?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I knew where this conversation was heading. "Victoria has offered to help us develop a more comprehensive approach to fundraising and donor relations," Patricia said, turning to face me. "She has experience and connections that could really transform what we're able to accomplish. But that kind of strategic work requires someone who can devote significant time and energy to building relationships with potential supporters." "I see," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I did. "I'm wondering if you might consider stepping back from some of your current responsibilities," Patricia continued. "Not because you aren't doing excellent work, but because it might allow you to focus more deeply on the areas where you have the most natural affinity." Natural affinity. The phrase hit me like a gentle slap. Polite, but unmistakably condescending. Patricia was suggesting that my natural affinity was for direct service work, the kind of hands-on programming that was valuable but not strategically important. Victoria's natural affinity was apparently for the sophisticated work of building relationships with serious donors. "What would that look like practically?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Well, Victoria has suggested that it might be beneficial to have someone focus specifically on donor cultivation and strategic planning," Patricia said. "Someone who could work closely with the board to develop long-term funding strategies. And of course, we'd still want you to continue your educational work, but perhaps with a more targeted focus." More targeted focus. Another polite way of saying that my responsibilities were being narrowed while Victoria's were being expanded. I was being shuffled sideways, moved from a position where I had input on organizational strategy to one where I would implement other people's decisions. "I'd need to think about it," I said, though I knew my thinking wouldn't ultimately matter. The decision had clearly already been made, and this conversation was simply Patricia's way of making it seem like I had a choice in the matter. "Of course," Patricia said, her smile warm but final. "Take all the time you need. I just want you to know that we value your contributions, and we want to make sure you're positioned to do your best work." I drove home that afternoon with a strange mix of anger and confusion swirling in my chest. I couldn't quite identify what had just happened, but I knew it wasn't what Patricia had presented it as. I wasn't being offered a better opportunity. I was being politely demoted to make room for someone Patricia found more impressive. When I tried to explain the situation to Robert that evening, he seemed genuinely confused by my reaction. "It sounds like she's trying to help you focus on the work you're most passionate about," he said, looking up from his laptop where he'd been reviewing contracts for one of his father's development projects. "Isn't that a good thing?" "Robert, she's essentially pushing me out of any meaningful decision-making role," I said, sitting down beside him on the couch. "Victoria is going to take over all the strategic planning and donor relations work that I've been doing for the past year." "But you hate donor relations," he pointed out. "You've told me dozens of times how much you prefer working directly with students to schmoozing with potential supporters." He wasn't wrong, but he was missing the point. "It's not about what I prefer," I said. "It's about being valued for my contributions, about having a voice in how programs are developed and implemented." Robert closed his laptop and turned to face me, his expression patient but slightly patronizing. "Emma, I think you might be overthinking this. My mother isn't trying to diminish your role. She's trying to bring in someone who can help the organization grow. That's good for everyone, including you." "How is it good for me to have my responsibilities reduced and my input minimized?" I asked. "Because it means you can focus on the work that actually matters to you," he said. "The teaching, the direct contact with students, the hands-on programming. That's what you're brilliant at, Emma. That's what makes you happy." But that wasn't what made me happy. Not anymore. What made me happy was feeling like I was contributing to something larger than myself. Like my ideas and insights were valued. like I was helping to shape the direction of programs that could impact hundreds of young people's lives. The direct teaching was meaningful, but it was only one part of what I'd been trying to build. "I don't think you understand what I'm trying to tell you," I said, feeling the familiar frustration of being misunderstood by someone who was supposed to know me better than anyone. "I understand that you're upset," Robert said, reaching for my hand. "But I also think you're letting your pride get in the way of seeing an opportunity." Victoria sounds like she has exactly the kind of experience that could help these organizations reach the next level. Pride. The word stung because it contained just enough truth to be believable. Maybe I was being prideful. Maybe I was resistant to change. Maybe I was threatened by someone who was clearly more qualified than I was for certain aspects of the work. But I was also being systematically excluded from conversations and decisions that I'd been part of for months. Over the following weeks, Victoria's presence became increasingly prominent in the arts community. She was invited to speak at conferences, quoted in newspaper articles about philanthropic trends, and introduced at social events as someone who was, quote, 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 revolutionizing arts funding in Metropolitan City. She seemed to know everyone who mattered, and to have opinions about everything from grant-writing strategies to corporate sponsorship opportunities. More troubling was the way she seemed to be positioning herself as the primary bridge between the arts organizations and the donor community. She organized exclusive dinners for potential supporters, created presentation materials that emphasized sophisticated funding approaches, and developed relationships with foundation program officers who controlled significant grant funding. "Victoria has such a gift for this work," Patricia said during one of our increasingly infrequent conversations. "She understands how to speak to donors in language they can relate to, how to present our programs in ways that demonstrate real impact and value." The implication was clear. I didn't understand how to speak to donors in language they could relate to. My approach to fundraising, which emphasized the direct human impact of arts education, was apparently less sophisticated than Victoria's focus on metrics and strategic outcomes. But the most painful part of Victoria's integration into the arts community was watching how she seemed to effortlessly command the respect and attention that I'd been working for years to earn. Board members who had politely nodded through my presentations now engaged in animated discussions about her proposals. Donors who had previously seemed skeptical of education-focused programming were suddenly enthusiastic about supporting initiatives that Victoria championed. "She just has a way of making people feel like they're part of something important," Margaret Holloway explained to me after a particularly successful fundraising event that Victoria had organized. "It's a rare talent, the ability to help donors understand not just what they're supporting, but why their support matters in the larger context of cultural philanthropy." I wanted to point out that I'd been trying to help donors understand exactly that for the past 2 years, but I realized it would sound petty. Victoria wasn't doing anything wrong. She was simply better at something that I'd thought I was reasonably competent at. The problem wasn't that she was succeeding. The problem was that her success was making my contributions seem less valuable by comparison. The shift in my relationship with Robert's family became more apparent during their monthly dinner parties. Elaborate affairs where Patricia would invite 24 people to discuss charitable projects and social developments over multi-course meals prepared by a chef who'd trained at the Culinary Institute. I'd been attending these dinners for 3 years, gradually learning the unspoken rules about which topics were appropriate for discussion and which guests were worth cultivating relationships with. But after Victoria's arrival, I noticed that the seating arrangements began to change. Instead of being placed near Patricia or other influential board members, I found myself at the opposite end of the table, seated next to spouses who weren't directly involved in philanthropic work. The conversations around me were pleasant but superficial, focused on travel plans and restaurant recommendations, rather than organizational strategy or program development. "Emma, how are your piano lessons going?" asked David Sterling's wife, a perfectly nice woman who seemed to think my primary occupation was teaching children to play scales. "Are you still working with those inner-city kids?" I tried to explain that my work with the Opera House involved much more than basic piano instruction, that I was involved in curriculum development and program evaluation and strategic planning. But she nodded politely and changed the subject to her own daughter's violin lessons, clearly not interested in the details of my professional responsibilities. Meanwhile, at the other end of the table, Victoria was engaged in an animated discussion with Patricia and Richard about the potential for creating an endowment fund that would provide sustainable funding for arts education programs. They were discussing exactly the kind of strategic initiative that I'd been proposing for months, but Victoria was presenting it with a sophistication and authority that seemed to make it suddenly viable. The key is to create a funding structure that can weather economic downturns, Victoria was saying, her voice carrying clearly across the dining room. If we can build an endowment of $2 million, the annual interest would provide a stable foundation for programming that wouldn't be dependent on year-to-year fundraising. $2 million. The figure made my breath catch, both because it was so much larger than anything I'd imagined, and because it was exactly the kind of transformative funding that could eliminate the constant financial uncertainty that plagued arts education programs. It was a brilliant idea, the kind of long-term thinking that could revolutionize how organizations approached program sustainability. But it was also an idea that built directly on work I'd been doing for the past year, research I'd compiled about successful endowment models at other institutions, conversations I'd had with program officers about the challenges of sustaining educational initiatives. Victoria was presenting it as her own insight, developed through her international experience and strategic expertise. Emma's been doing some interesting work on program sustainability, Patricia said, glancing in my direction. Haven't you, dear? It was a polite acknowledgement, the kind of comment that suggested she remembered I'd been involved in related work, but couldn't quite recall the details. I smiled and nodded, knowing that anything I said would seem like I was trying to claim credit for Victoria's proposal. That's wonderful, Victoria said, her smile warm but dismissive. It's always helpful to have input from people who are working directly with students. They bring such valuable perspectives about what actually works in practice. Such valuable perspectives. The phrase made me sound like a well-meaning amateur, whose opinions were worth believed I was developing. All the respect I'd imagined I was earning, it was all apparently an illusion. I was the person who couldn't see the forest for the trees, who took feedback too personally, who lacked the strategic perspective necessary for organizational growth. I was competent at what I did, but what I did wasn't particularly important in the larger scheme of things. I gathered my papers and left through the side door, driving home with tears I didn't fully understand streaming down my face. When Robert asked about my day, I told him the meeting had been canceled. I couldn't bring myself to explain what I'd learned about how his family actually viewed my contributions to their philanthropic efforts. The next few months passed in a blur of gradual marginalization. My responsibilities were systematically transferred to Victoria, always with explanations that made the changes seem reasonable and strategic. Victoria would handle donor relations because she had experience with high-level philanthropic engagement. Victoria would oversee program development because she understood best practices from international institutions. Victoria would represent the organization at conferences because she could speak authoritatively about funding strategies. My role became increasingly focused on direct service, the hands-on teaching and student support that everyone agreed was valuable, but that didn't require strategic thinking or organizational leadership. I was still involved in important work, but I was no longer involved in decisions about how that work was structured or funded. The anonymous donation that had started everything became a source of particular frustration. Victoria regularly praised the visionary donor who had provided seed funding for the youth program, speculating about their motivations and suggesting ways to cultivate their continued support. She seemed to assume that the donor was someone from the established philanthropic community, someone who shared her sophisticated understanding of strategic giving. Whoever they are, they clearly understand the importance of investing in systemic change rather than just individual outcomes, Victoria said during one board meeting. The youth program has become a model for other organizations precisely because it was designed with long-term sustainability in mind. Long-term sustainability. The program had been designed with long-term sustainability in mind because I'd used every dollar of my inheritance to ensure it would have adequate funding to survive its first few years. But Victoria was attributing the program's success to the donor's strategic vision, rather than recognizing that the donor had simply wanted to give other kids the opportunities that music education had provided for her. I'd love to know more about their background, Patricia said. Someone who gives that generously at such a young age, assuming they're young, must have some personal connection to music education. They were sitting 3 feet away from the donor they were speculating about, but I might as well have been invisible. The possibility that I might have been capable of making such a significant gift apparently never occurred to either of them. People like me receive donations. We didn't make them. The final straw came during the Opera House's annual gala, an event that had become increasingly important as Victoria transformed it into a showcase for the organization's sophisticated approach to arts funding. I'd been involved in planning previous galas, helping to select performers and develop program materials that would highlight the educational initiatives we were supporting. But this year's gala was entirely Victoria's creation, from the guest list to the program design to the fundraising strategy. She'd arranged for a prominent soprano to perform selections from Carmen, organized a silent auction featuring artwork donated by local artists, and created presentation materials that emphasize the organization's commitment to, quote, transformative philanthropic partnerships. This is going to be our most successful gala ever, Patricia said as we reviewed the final preparations. Victoria has really outdone herself. I stood at the edge of the conversation, holding a clipboard with information about the youth program that I'd been asked to have available in case anyone wanted details about educational initiatives. It was a supporting role, important but not central, useful but not essential. Emma, you look lovely, Victoria said, noticing me for the first time. That dress is perfect for the occasion. The dress was the same one I'd worn to last year's gala, and the year before that. I'd been hoping to buy something new, but my reduced role with the Arts Council had also meant reduced compensation, and I was back to counting dollars the way I had before marrying Robert. Thank you, I said, smiling with what I hoped looked like genuine warmth. Everything looks wonderful. I'm so glad you think so, Victoria said. It's been such a collaborative effort, bringing together so many different perspectives and areas of expertise. Collaborative effort. I wondered what my perspective and expertise had contributed to the event, besides being available to answer questions about programs that Victoria had systematically taken credit for developing. The gala itself was undeniably successful. The soprano's performance was breathtaking, the silent auction raised more money than any previous year, and the presentation about the organization's strategic vision was so compelling that several new donors made commitments on the spot. Victoria moved through the evening with the confidence of someone who had orchestrated a triumph, accepting congratulations and making connections that would benefit the organization for years to come. I spent the evening standing next to an informational display about the youth program, available to provide details about curriculum and student outcomes to anyone who expressed interest. A few people stopped by to ask questions, mostly parents who were curious about opportunities for their own children. The conversations were pleasant but superficial, focused on logistics rather than the deeper questions about program design and impact that I'd been hoping to discuss. Emma, Patricia said, approaching my station near the end of the evening. I want to thank you for being here tonight. I know it's not the most glamorous assignment, but it's important to have someone who can speak knowledgeably about the direct service aspects of our work. Direct service aspects. Not the strategic vision or the funding model or the organizational structure, but the direct service aspects. I was the person who could explain how the programs actually worked, not the person who had designed them, or secured their funding, or developed their theoretical framework. Of course, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was agreeing to. I'm glad I could be helpful. Victoria was just telling me about some ideas she has for expanding the youth program, Patricia continued. She thinks there might be opportunities to replicate the model in other communities, maybe even develop it into a statewide initiative. Replicate the model, expand the program, develop it into a statewide initiative. All ideas that built directly on work I'd been doing for the past 3 years. Research I'd compiled about successful arts education programs. Relationships I'd developed with teachers and administrators in other communities. But Victoria was the one who would get to present these ideas to potential funders, to travel to conferences and speak about program development, to build the professional relationships that would make expansion possible. I would continue to work with individual students, to handle the direct service aspects of program implementation, to provide the hands-on teaching that everyone agreed was valuable, but that wasn't strategically important. "That sounds wonderful," I said, and I meant it. The program's expansion would benefit more young people, create more opportunities for music education, fulfill exactly the kind of vision I'd had when I'd first made the anonymous donation. The fact that I wouldn't be involved in the services, but who didn't need to be included in the important conversations, or recognized for significant contributions. The woman who had once believed she could build something meaningful, who had sacrificed her grandmother's inheritance to create opportunities for young musicians, who had dreamed of being recognized as a strategic partner in transformative philanthropic work, that woman was gradually disappearing. In her place was someone smaller, quieter, more accommodating, someone who understood her place and was grateful for the opportunity to serve in whatever capacity was considered appropriate, someone who was learning to be invisible in her own life, to watch other people receive credit for her contributions, to accept marginalization as evidence of her own professional limitations, rather than as a deliberate exclusion from conversations and decisions that should have included her. Someone who was about to discover that invisible women sometimes have the most power of all, because no one bothers to consider what they might be capable of when they finally decide they've had enough. The invitation arrived on cream-colored paper with gold embossing, the kind of formal stationery that suggested an event of significant importance. "The Metropolitan Opera House cordially invites you to the 5th Annual Youth Music Program Gala," it read, "celebrating 5 years of transformative arts education and honoring our anonymous founding donor." The date was circled in red ink, with a handwritten note from Patricia in the margin. "This will be our most prestigious event yet. Victoria has outdone herself with the planning." I held the invitation in my hands, feeling the weight of expensive paper and the irony of being invited to celebrate a program I had secretly funded. 5 years ago, I had transferred my grandmother's inheritance to establish this very initiative, and now I was being invited to attend its anniversary celebration as a guest, rather than being recognized as its creator. The anonymous founding donor they were honoring was me, but I would be sitting in the audience applauding while others received credit for the program's success. "This is going to be incredible," Robert said, reading the invitation over my shoulder. "Victoria has been working on this for months. She's managed to get the mayor to attend, and apparently there's going to be a special performance by students from the program." A special performance by students from the program I had made possible. I should have felt proud, knowing that young musicians would have the opportunity to showcase their talents on one of the city's most prestigious stages. Instead, I felt hollow, watching my own contributions being celebrated while I remained invisible. "It says here that they're planning to announce a major expansion of the program," Robert continued, pointing to a line of text I'd somehow missed. "Victoria must have secured some serious funding commitments." Major expansion. The program I had envisioned as a small initiative to help a few dozen kids had grown into something much larger, thanks to Victoria's strategic vision and fundraising expertise. She was taking the foundation I had provided and building an empire on top of it, creating opportunities for hundreds of young musicians across the city. "That's wonderful," I said, though my voice sounded strained even to my own ears. "More kids will benefit from music education. You don't sound very enthusiastic," Robert observed, settling beside me on the couch. "I thought you'd be excited about the program's expansion." I was excited about the program's expansion, but I was also devastated by my own invisibility in the process. How could I explain to Robert that I was struggling with watching other people receive recognition for work that had been built on my foundation, literally and figuratively? How could I tell him that his family's dismissal of my contributions had made me feel like a stranger in my own life? "I am excited," I said, forcing a smile. "I just hope the expansion doesn't compromise the quality of the programming." "I'm sure Victoria has thought of that," Robert said. "She's incredibly thorough when it comes to strategic planning." Victoria was incredibly thorough when it came to strategic planning, which was exactly the problem. She had systematically taken over every aspect of the program's development, from fundraising to curriculum design to public relations. My role had been reduced to that of an occasional consultant, someone who could provide input about direct service delivery, but who wasn't involved in decisions about program direction or organizational growth. The weeks leading up to the gala were a whirlwind of preparation and excitement. Patricia hosted several planning meetings at her home, gatherings where Victoria would present updates on ticket sales, sponsor commitments, and program details. I attended these meetings as a peripheral participant, taking notes and offering suggestions that were politely acknowledged but rarely incorporated into the final plans. The mayor's office has confirmed that he'll be presenting the recognition award to our anonymous donor, Victoria announced during one of these meetings. Obviously, since we don't know who they are, we'll be presenting it to an empty chair as a symbolic gesture. An empty chair. The recognition award for my donation would be presented to an empty chair while I sat in the audience, watching a symbolic gesture honor my own generosity. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe around it. "That's a lovely touch," said Margaret Holloway, who had become one of Victoria's most enthusiastic supporters. "It really emphasizes the selfless nature of philanthropic giving." Selfless nature. If only they knew that the selfless donor they were honoring was sitting at the same table, invisible in plain sight, watching her own contributions be transformed into a symbolic gesture. I've also arranged for several of the program's success stories to speak about the impact of arts education on their lives, Victoria continued. These are young people who've gone on to attend prestigious music schools, win competitions, perform with professional orchestras. Their testimonials will really demonstrate the transformative power of strategic investment in youth development. Transformative power of strategic investment. The young people Victoria was referring to had been part of the program since its inception, students who had received scholarships and mentorship opportunities that I had made possible through my anonymous donation. But Victoria was presenting their success as evidence of her strategic vision, rather than acknowledging that their opportunities had been funded by someone else's sacrifice. "Emma," Patricia said, turning to me with what seemed like an afterthought, "you've worked directly with many of these students. Would you be willing to help with their preparation for the speaking portion of the evening?" Of course I would help with their preparation. I was always willing to handle the direct service aspects of program implementation. The hands-on work that everyone agreed was valuable but that didn't require strategic thinking or organizational leadership. I was the person who could work with students on their public speaking skills while other people received recognition for their strategic contributions. "I'd be happy to help," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure happiness was the right word for what I was feeling. "Wonderful," Victoria said, making a note on her tablet. "I'll send you the list of speakers and their prepared remarks. We want to make sure their presentations align with the overall message of the evening. Align with the overall message." Even the students' own stories about their experiences in the program would be filtered through Victoria's strategic vision, edited to emphasize the themes and messages that she had determined were most important for the audience to hear. The evening of the gala arrived with all the pageantry and sophistication that Victoria had promised. The Metropolitan Opera House was transformed into a glittering showcase of the city's cultural elite, with champagne reception tables arranged throughout the lobby and a red carpet entrance that drew local media attention. I wore my best dress, a navy blue gown that I'd owned for several years but that still looked elegant enough for the occasion. "You look beautiful," Robert said as we walked up the Opera House steps, past photographers who were capturing images of the evening's most prominent attendees. "This is going to be a night to remember. A night to remember." I was about to watch my own philanthropic contribution be celebrated while I remained anonymous not by choice, but by circumstance. Invisible, not because I preferred privacy, but because no one had bothered to consider that I might be capable of making such a significant gift. The reception was exactly what I'd expected, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and influence, with guests who moved through the space like they owned it. Victoria was everywhere at once, greeting donors, directing staff, ensuring that every detail of the evening proceeded according to her meticulous planning. She wore a stunning emerald gown that must have cost more than my monthly salary, and she moved with the confidence of someone who had orchestrated a triumph. "Emma, how lovely to see you," she said, approaching me with a smile that was warm but slightly patronizing. "I'm so glad you could be here tonight. This program has been such a success, and we couldn't have done it without the support of dedicated volunteers like you. Dedicated volunteers like me. Not strategic partners or program developers or founding contributors, but dedicated volunteers. People who provided valuable services, but who weren't essential to the organization's strategic direction. "It's wonderful to see how much the program has grown," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "The students must be so excited to perform tonight." "They are," Victoria said, her smile becoming more genuine. "And their families are incredibly grateful for the opportunities they've received. This is exactly the kind of transformative impact that strategic philanthropy can achieve." Strategic philanthropy. The opportunities that the students and their families were grateful for had been made possible by my grandmother's inheritance. Money that had been earned through decades of running a small flower shop and saved carefully for her granddaughter's future. But Victoria was presenting their success as evidence of strategic philanthropy, rather than acknowledging that their foundation had been built on someone else's sacrifice. "Ladies and gentlemen," came an announcement over the reception area's sound system. "Please take your seats for this evening's program." The Opera House's main auditorium had been transformed for the occasion, with special lighting and floral arrangements that created an atmosphere of elegance and celebration. I found my seat in the third row, close enough to see the stage clearly but far enough from the front to reinforce my status as a supporting participant rather than a central figure. Patricia was seated in the front row, wearing a burgundy gown that complemented her silver hair and diamond jewelry. She looked every inch the philanthropic matriarch, someone who had dedicated her life to supporting the arts and nurturing young talent. Beside her sat Richard, distinguished in his black tuxedo, and Vanessa with her husband David, representing the Sterling family's commitment to cultural philanthropy. The program began with a performance by the Opera House's youth orchestra, 25 young musicians who had been selected from the program's most advanced students. They performed a piece by Mozart that required considerable skill and coordination, demonstrating the high level of training they had received through the program I had made possible. As I watched these young people play with such passion and precision, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in their accomplishments, satisfaction in knowing that my contribution had made their training possible, but also a deep sadness about my own invisibility in their success. These students had no idea that the woman sitting in the third row had sacrificed her inheritance to create the opportunities they were now showcasing. "Our next speaker," announced the evening's host, a prominent local television personality, "is Victoria Ashford, the strategic visionary who has transformed arts education in our city through her innovative approaches to program development and donor relations." Strategic visionary. Victoria walked onto the stage with the poise of someone who belonged there, someone who had earned the right to be recognized as a leader in her field. She spoke eloquently about the importance of arts education, the need for strategic investment in youth development, and the transformative power of music in young people's lives. "5 years ago," she said, addressing the audience with practiced authority, "a visionary donor made a remarkable gift that allowed us to launch this program. That anonymous benefactor understood something that many philanthropists struggle to grasp. That true impact comes not from scattered giving, but from strategic investment in initiatives that can create lasting change." Strategic investment. My grandmother's inheritance had been strategic investment, though not in the way Victoria was describing it. It had been strategic in the sense that I had understood the transformative power of music education from personal experience. But it hadn't been strategic in the sense of being part of a calculated philanthropic portfolio. "Tonight, we honor that anonymous donor not only for their generosity but for their wisdom," Victoria continued. "They saw the potential for this program to become something much larger than its initial scope, and their gift has created a foundation that will benefit young musicians for generations to come." The audience applauded enthusiastically, and I found myself clapping along with them, honoring my own contribution while remaining invisible to everyone around me. Victoria was describing my donation as evidence of strategic wisdom, rather than acknowledging that it had been an act of love, a way of honoring my grandmother's memory, while creating opportunities for other young people who shared my background. "And now," Victoria said, her voice taking on a more personal tone, "I'd like to invite Mayor Richardson to present our recognition award to our anonymous founding donor." The mayor, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and a politician's practiced smile, walked onto the stage carrying a crystal award that caught the stage lights like captured starlight. He spoke briefly about the importance of arts education and the city's commitment to supporting cultural initiatives, then turned toward an empty chair that had been placed center stage. "This award is presented to our anonymous donor," he said, placing the crystal sculpture on the empty chair, "with gratitude for their vision, their generosity, and their commitment to nurturing the next generation of musical talent." The audience rose in a standing ovation, applauding the empty chair while I stood among them, watching my own recognition be given to a piece of furniture. The symbolism was perfect in its cruelty. I was being honored for my contribution while remaining physically absent from my own recognition. But the real devastation was still to come. As the formal program concluded and guests began to move toward the reception area for dinner, I found myself standing near the bar, trying to process the complex emotions of watching my own philanthropy be celebrated while I remained invisible. "Can you believe how much money these people throw around?" I heard a voice say behind me. I turned to see two women I didn't recognize, both elegantly dressed and clearly part of the evening's guest list. "I know," replied her companion. "Did you see that young woman at the Whitmore table? Robert's wife? She's been coming to these events for years, always trying to insert herself into conversations about major donations." They were talking about me. I stood frozen, my wine glass halfway to my lips, realizing that I was overhearing a conversation about my own social positioning. "Patricia told me she's some kind of piano teacher," the first woman continued. "Apparently she's been pushing for years to get more involved in the strategic side of things, but she doesn't really understand how serious philanthropy works." Piano teacher. Someone who didn't understand how serious philanthropy works. I was being dismissed as a social climber who was trying to gain access to a world she didn't belong in, by women who had no idea that I had probably contributed more to the evening's cause than they ever would. "It's always awkward when people marry into these families," the second woman said. "They think that gives them automatic credibility in charitable circles, but real philanthropic work requires a completely different skill set." Real philanthropic work. I had given $25,000 to establish the program they were celebrating, but apparently that didn't qualify as real philanthropic work because I wasn't part of their established social circle. I heard Patricia saying that she's had to be very diplomatic about managing her expectations, the first woman continued. "Apparently she wants to be involved in donor relations and strategic planning, but she's just not suited for that level of responsibility. Not suited for that level of responsibility." I was standing 10 feet away from the recognition award that had been presented to honor my own donation, listening to strangers explain why I wasn't qualified to be involved in philanthropic work. But the conversation that truly shattered me was the one I overheard an hour later, during the dinner portion of the evening. I had excused myself to use the restroom and was walking back toward my table when I heard Patricia's voice coming from the private dining room, where the evening's most important guests were seated. "The problem with Emma," Patricia was saying, "is that she's always been more interested in the social aspects of philanthropy than the actual work. She attends every event, volunteers for every committee, but she doesn't really understand the strategic thinking that's required for effective charitable giving." Social aspects of philanthropy. I was being characterized as someone who was more interested in social climbing than in making a meaningful impact, by a woman who had no idea that I had sacrificed my inheritance to create the program she was discussing. "It's difficult when someone marries into a family with philanthropic traditions," said a voice I recognized as Victoria's. "They often assume that gives them automatic expertise in charitable work, but strategic philanthropy requires a completely different approach than what most people are familiar with." Strategic philanthropy. Victoria was explaining to the evening's most influential guests that I lacked the expertise necessary for strategic philanthropy, while sitting in a room that was celebrating the success of a program I had strategically funded. "I've tried to be supportive," Patricia continued, "but I've had to be very clear about the distinction between volunteering and leadership. Emma is wonderful at the hands-on aspects of program implementation, but she doesn't have the background or perspective necessary for high-level donor relations." High-level donor relations. I was being excluded from high-level donor relations because I supposedly lacked the background necessary for that kind of work, while the evening's highest-level donor was standing in the hallway listening to her own dismissal. "It's challenging," agreed another voice, one I recognized as Margaret Holloway's. "You want to be inclusive and supportive, but you also have to protect the organization's reputation. When someone doesn't understand the subtle dynamics of philanthropic culture, they can inadvertently damage relationships with serious donors." Serious donors. I was being characterized as someone who might damage relationships with serious donors. by women who were celebrating the generosity of the serious donor they were concerned about protecting the organization from. But the comment that cut deepest came from Patricia herself, delivered in the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "Honestly," she said, "I've always suspected that Emma's interest in our charitable work has more to do with social positioning than genuine commitment to the causes. She's never made any significant financial contributions herself, but she's always eager to be associated with our family's philanthropic activities. Never made any significant financial contributions. I was being accused of being a social climber who was trying to gain status through association with the Whitmore family's charitable giving, by the woman who had just spent an evening celebrating the significant financial contribution I had made anonymously. It's the classic fortune hunter pattern," said Victoria, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. They marry into established families and then try to leverage those connections for their own social advancement. Fortune hunter. Victoria was describing me as a fortune hunter, someone who had married Robert for his family's wealth and social position. The irony was so brutal, I could barely breathe around it. I was being called a fortune hunter while standing in a building where I had anonymously donated more money than most of the evening's guests would contribute in their entire lifetimes. "I hate to say it," Patricia continued, "but I think we need to be more careful about how much access we give her to our donor network. She means well, but she doesn't understand the delicate relationships that sustain this kind of work." Delicate relationships. I was being excluded from the donor network because I supposedly didn't understand the delicate relationships that sustained philanthropic work, while the evening's program was celebrating the success of an initiative that I had personally sustained through my own contribution. I stood in that hallway, listening to my mother-in-law and her friends discuss my professional limitations and social motivations, feeling something fundamental shift inside me. The woman who had spent 5 years trying to earn recognition for her contributions, who had gradually accepted marginalization as evidence of her own inadequacy, who had allowed herself to be redefined as a dedicated volunteer rather than a strategic partner. That woman was disappearing. In her place was someone who understood exactly what she was dealing with. A group of people who were so blinded by their own assumptions about class and social position that they couldn't recognize the donor they were celebrating was standing right in front of them. I walked back to my table and sat down beside Robert, who was engaged in animated conversation with David Sterling about the evening's success. "This has been incredible," Robert said, noticing my return. "Victoria really outdid herself. The program presentations were so compelling, and the fundraising results are apparently going to exceed all expectations." "It's been remarkable," I agreed, though I wasn't thinking about the program presentations or the fundraising results. I was thinking about the conversation I just overheard, the casual dismissal of my contributions and motivations by people who had no idea who they were actually talking about. "The expansion announcements are going to be game-changing," David added. "Victoria's vision for scaling this program to other cities is exactly the kind of strategic thinking that creates lasting impact." Strategic thinking. Victoria's vision for scaling the program was built on the foundation I had provided, funded by the money I had contributed, made possible by the strategic decision I had made to invest my inheritance in youth music education. But she was being credited with strategic thinking while I was being dismissed as a fortune hunter. "Emma," Robert said, turning to me with curiosity, "you've been awfully quiet tonight. What did you think of Victoria's presentation?" I looked at my husband, this man who loved me genuinely, but who had never understood the depth of my contributions to his family's philanthropic work. He saw Victoria's presentation as evidence of strategic brilliance, not recognizing that it was built on ideas and initiatives that I had been developing for years before she arrived. "I thought it was very well executed," I said, which was true. Victoria had executed her presentation brilliantly, taking credit for work that others had done while positioning herself as the visionary leader who had made it all possible. "I'm so proud of how supportive you've been through all of this," Robert said, taking my hand under the table. "I know it hasn't been easy to watch someone else take the lead on projects you've been involved with, but you've handled it with such grace." Grace again. I was being praised for handling my own professional marginalization with grace, which apparently was more valuable than being recognized for my actual contributions. I was being celebrated for being a good sport about being sidelined, for accepting diminishment without complaint. I just want what's best for the program, I said, and it was true. I did want what was best for the program, which was why I had sacrificed my inheritance to make it possible. But I also wanted what was best for myself, which apparently made me a fortune hunter with social climbing aspirations. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself standing in the Opera House lobby, watching Victoria accept congratulations from the evening's most influential attendees. She was glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had orchestrated a triumph, someone who had positioned herself at the center of something important and transformative. "Emma," came a voice behind me. I turned to see Marcus Rivera, the development director who had facilitated my anonymous donation 5 years ago. He was one of the few people who knew the truth about the program's founding, though we had maintained the fiction of anonymity even in our professional interactions. "Marcus," I said, surprised to see him approaching me directly. "How are you?" "I'm well," he said, though his expression suggested he had something specific he wanted to discuss. "I wonder if I might have a word with you privately." We walked toward a quieter corner of the lobby, away from the clusters of guests who were making their final social connections before heading home. "I wanted to thank you," Marcus said quietly, "for everything you've done for this program. I know tonight's recognition couldn't acknowledge your actual contribution, but I hope you know how much your support has meant. Your support." Marcus was one of the few people who understood that my support had been foundational rather than peripheral, financial rather than just advisory. He had been there when I had made the initial donation, had helped me structure it to maximize its impact, had watched the program grow from my seed funding into something much larger. "The program's success is what matters," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it anymore. "The students are getting opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise." "That's true," Marcus agreed. "But I also think you should know that your original vision for the program has been essential to its development. The direct service approach you advocated for, the focus on individualized instruction, the emphasis on creating pathways to advanced training, all of that has been central to what's made this initiative so successful." My original vision. Marcus was acknowledging that the program's success was built on approaches I had advocated for, ideas I had developed, strategies I had insisted on when I had made the initial donation. But none of that was visible to the people who were celebrating the program's achievements. "I'm glad the approach has worked," I said, though I was thinking about the conversation I'd overheard. The dismissal of my contributions and motivations by people who had no idea what they were actually talking about. "Emma," Marcus said, lowering his voice slightly, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you satisfied with how your involvement with the program has evolved? I know there have been some organizational changes, and I wanted to make sure you felt like your perspective was still being valued." Was I satisfied with how my involvement had evolved? I was being asked to evaluate my own marginalization by someone who understood what I had actually contributed, someone who recognized that my perspective might be worth considering. "It's been an interesting transition," I said diplomatically. "Victoria brings a lot of expertise to the strategic aspects of program development." "She does," Marcus agreed. "But I hope that doesn't mean we're losing sight of the direct service philosophy that made this program unique in the first place. The students and families we serve have always been the heart of what we do." The students and families we serve. Marcus was reminding me that the program's real impact was measured in the lives of young people who had received opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise, not in the recognition or credit that various adults received for making those opportunities possible. "The students are definitely the heart of it," I said, though I was thinking about something else. I was thinking about the conversation I'd overheard, the casual dismissal of my contributions, by people who had no idea what they were actually talking about. I was thinking about being called a fortune hunter while standing in a building where I had donated more money than most of the evening's guests would contribute in their entire lifetimes. "Marcus," I said, making a decision that surprised me even as I spoke, "I wonder if you might be willing to meet with me sometime next week. There are some things I'd like to discuss about the program's development and my ongoing involvement." Of course, he said, though I could see curiosity in his eyes. Is there something specific you'd like to talk about? I'm not entirely sure yet, I said, which was true. I wasn't sure what I wanted to discuss with Marcus, but I knew I needed to talk to someone who understood the full scope of my contributions to the program's success. I needed to talk to someone who might be able to help me figure out what to do about the growing recognition that I was being systematically erased from my own philanthropic story. I'll call you Monday, Marcus said. And Emma, I hope you know that whatever changes have happened organizationally, your contributions to this program will always be foundational to its success. Foundational to its success. Marcus understood that my contributions had been foundational, even if no one else seemed to recognize that fact. He understood that the program's achievements were built on more than just Victoria's strategic vision, that there had been other people whose ideas and resources had made the current success possible. I drove home that night with a strange mix of emotions swirling in my chest. Pride in the program's achievements, satisfaction in knowing that young musicians were receiving opportunities that would change their lives, but also a deep anger about my own invisibility in the process. I was the anonymous donor who had been honored with an empty chair while I sat in the audience. I was the fortune hunter who had been dismissed for never making significant financial contributions while standing in a building where I had donated $25,000. I was the social climber who was supposedly more interested in status than substance, while watching other people receive recognition for work that had been built on my foundation. But I was also someone who had finally understood exactly what I was dealing with. A group of people who were so blinded by their own assumptions about class and social position that they had no idea who they were actually talking about. And for the first time in 5 years, I was beginning to think that maybe it was time for them to find out. The coffee shop near the Opera House was nearly empty on Tuesday morning, just a few regulars nursing their drinks while reading newspapers or tapping away at laptops. Marcus Rivera sat across from me in a corner booth, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern as I explained what I'd overheard at the gala. "They called you a fortune hunter?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emma, these people have no idea what they're talking about. You literally funded the program they were celebrating." "That's exactly the point," I said, stirring sugar into my coffee with more force than necessary. "They're so convinced of their own assumptions about who belongs in their world that they can't see what's right in front of them." Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing what I'd told him about the conversations I'd overheard. As the development director, he understood better than most how philanthropic recognition worked, how credit was assigned and reputation was built in the nonprofit world. "The irony is staggering," he said finally. "Patricia has built her entire reputation around that program. She speaks at conferences about it, uses it as her signature achievement on grant applications, lists it as her primary accomplishment on board biographies. And Victoria is positioning herself as the strategic mastermind behind its expansion," I added. "She's parlaying her association with the program into consulting opportunities with other organizations." "While you remain anonymous and invisible," Marcus said, shaking his head. "Emma, I have to ask, are you satisfied with continuing the anonymity? Because there are ways to change that if you want to." I had been thinking about exactly that question since the gala, turning it over in my mind during sleepless nights when I replayed Patricia's dismissive comments and Victoria's casual categorization of me as a social climber. For 5 years, I had maintained my anonymity because I believed it was the noble thing to do, the pure way to give without expectation of recognition. "What would it look like to change that?" I asked. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. "Anonymous donations can be revealed if the donor chooses to do so. It's not uncommon for people to remain anonymous initially and then step forward later, especially when they want to encourage other giving or take a more active role in program development." "You mean I could just announce that I was the founding donor?" "With proper documentation, absolutely. I have all the original paperwork, bank records, correspondence about your gift. There's no question about the legitimacy of your contribution or the timeline of when it was made." The possibility sent a thrill of anticipation through me, followed immediately by anxiety about the implications. Revealing my identity as the anonymous donor would certainly shock Patricia and Victoria, but it would also fundamentally change my relationship with Robert's family. "There's something else to consider," Marcus continued. "The program is coming up for a major grant review next month. The Hartwell Foundation is considering a $3 million commitment that would fund the statewide expansion Victoria has been promoting. $3 million. The number was staggering, representing a level of funding that would transform the program from a local initiative into a regional model. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that Victoria had been working toward, the culmination of her strategic vision for scaling successful programs. The foundation is very interested in the program's origin story, Marcus explained. They want to understand how it was conceived, who the founding stakeholders were, what the original vision encompassed. They've specifically asked about the anonymous donor and whether that person might be willing to participate in their evaluation process. Participate how? They want to interview the founding donor about their motivations, their ongoing commitment, their perspective on the program's development. It's standard due diligence for major grants. They want to ensure that key supporters remain engaged and that the program's foundational principles are being maintained. I felt something click into place, a recognition of opportunity that was almost too perfect to believe. The Hartwell Foundation wanted to interview the founding donor about the program's development and foundational principles, at exactly the moment when those principles were being abandoned in favor of Victoria's strategic vision. When is this interview supposed to take place? I asked. The foundation is planning a site visit for next Thursday. They'll tour the facilities, observe some classes, meet with staff and board members. The interview with the anonymous donor was tentatively scheduled for that afternoon. Next Thursday. 7 days to decide whether I wanted to remain invisible or step forward and claim credit for the contribution that had made everything possible. 7 days to decide whether I was comfortable continuing to watch other people receive recognition for my sacrifice. Marcus, I said, making a decision that surprised me with its certainty, I want to participate in that interview. His eyebrows rose. You're sure? Once you reveal your identity, there's no going back to anonymity. I'm sure, I said, though my heart was racing. I want them to know who really established this program and why. Marcus smiled, the first genuinely enthusiastic expression I'd seen from him all morning. Emma, I think this could be exactly what the program needs. The foundation is very focused on authentic community connections and grassroots support. Learning that the founding donor was someone with direct experience in music education, someone who understood the challenges these students face, that's going to resonate strongly with their values. We spent the next hour planning the logistics of my revelation. Marcus would contact the foundation to confirm that the anonymous donor was ready to participate in their evaluation process. He would provide them with background information about my credentials in music education and my ongoing involvement with the program. There's one more thing, Marcus said as we prepared to leave. The foundation has invited all major stakeholders to attend a reception after their site visit. Board members, significant donors, community partners. It's meant to be an opportunity for them to see the program's support network and assess the sustainability of the relationships involved. A reception with all major stakeholders. Patricia would be there, certainly, along with Victoria and the other board members who had been taking credit for the program's success. Robert would probably attend, representing the Whitmore family's support for arts education. Will you be announcing my identity at that reception? I asked. Only if you want to, Marcus said. But it might be an appropriate venue for introducing the foundation to the person whose vision made their potential investment possible. The person whose vision made their potential investment possible. After 5 years of being marginalized as a dedicated volunteer, dismissed as a fortune hunter, and excluded from strategic conversations, I was going to be introduced as the visionary whose contribution had made a $3 million grant opportunity possible. I spent the following week in a state of nervous anticipation, alternating between excitement about finally receiving recognition for my contribution and anxiety about the confrontation that would inevitably follow. I didn't tell Robert about my plans, partly because I wanted to surprise him, and partly because I wasn't sure how he would react to learning that his family had been systematically dismissing the woman who had funded their most celebrated philanthropic achievement. The Hartwell Foundation's site visit began Thursday morning with a tour of the Opera House's education facilities. I arrived early, ostensibly to help with preparations, but actually to observe the foundation representatives as they evaluated the program I had made possible. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the foundation's president, was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of quiet authority that suggested someone accustomed to making decisions about large sums of money. She was accompanied by two program officers who took detailed notes as they observed classes and interviewed students. This is exactly the kind of direct, personal instruction that creates lasting impact, Dr. Hartwell commented as she watched one of the program's violin teachers working with a young student. You can see the individual attention, the tailored approach to each child's learning style. Individual attention and tailored approach. Those had been central elements of my original vision for the program, principles I had insisted on when I made the founding donation. I had argued that effective music education required small class sizes and personalized instruction, even though those approaches were more expensive than the large group classes that most programs offered. The curriculum design is very sophisticated, noted one of the program officers. Someone clearly understood both pedagogical best practices and the practical challenges of serving students from diverse economic backgrounds. Someone clearly understood. I watched from the back of the room as foundation representatives praised the program design that I had developed, the pedagogical approaches I had researched, the practical solutions I had insisted on implementing. Victoria appeared at my elbow, wearing a navy suit that projected professional competence and carrying a folder of materials she had prepared for the foundation's review. "Isn't it wonderful to see their enthusiasm?" she said, her voice warm with the satisfaction of someone whose work was being validated. Dr. Hartwell seems particularly impressed with the strategic framework we've developed. Victoria was already claiming credit for the foundation's positive response, positioning herself as the architect of everything they were praising. "The program has certainly evolved significantly," I said carefully. "It has," Victoria agreed. "I think the key has been developing a more systematic approach to program delivery and evaluation. The original model was quite good, but it needed strategic refinement to reach its full potential." Strategic refinement. Victoria was describing the systematic transformation of my program design as strategic refinement, suggesting that the original model had been somehow inadequate until she arrived to fix it. The foundation's formal presentations took place that afternoon in the Opera House's boardroom. Patricia sat at the head of the table, wearing a burgundy suit that projected philanthropic gravitas. Victoria was positioned to her right, with materials spread before her that documented the program's achievements and expansion plans. "We're particularly proud of this initiative," Patricia began, addressing Dr. Hartwell and her colleagues, "because it represents exactly the kind of strategic philanthropy that creates sustainable impact. The program was launched with a generous gift from an anonymous donor who shared our vision for transformative arts education." Shared our vision. Patricia was claiming that the anonymous donor had shared her vision, when in fact my vision had shaped every aspect of the program's original design. "Victoria has been instrumental in scaling the program beyond its initial scope," Patricia continued. "Her strategic expertise has allowed us to develop the kind of systematic approach that makes expansion possible." Victoria smiled graciously, accepting credit for scaling the program that had been built on my foundation. "The original program was quite successful," she said, "but we recognized that to create lasting regional impact, we needed to develop more sophisticated systems for curriculum delivery, teacher training, and outcome measurement." More sophisticated systems. Victoria was presenting her modifications to my program design as sophistication, suggesting that the original approach had been somehow primitive or inadequate. "Could you tell us more about the anonymous donor?" asked one of the program officers. "Understanding their motivations and ongoing engagement is important for our evaluation." Patricia and Victoria exchanged a glance that I recognized as slight discomfort. They had been taking credit for the program's success for so long that they had almost forgotten that someone else had actually made it possible. "The donor has remained quite private," Patricia said. "But their gift demonstrated remarkable foresight about the potential for arts education to transform young people's lives." Remarkable foresight. My decision to donate my grandmother's inheritance was being characterized as remarkable foresight. as if I had somehow predicted the program's future success rather than simply wanting to create opportunities for other young musicians. "We've respected their desire for anonymity," Victoria added, "but we understand they remain supportive of the program's development." Remain supportive. Victoria was speaking about my ongoing support as if she had some knowledge of my current feelings about the program's direction, when in fact she had no idea what the anonymous donor thought about anything. "Actually," came a voice from the doorway, "the anonymous donor is here today and would like to participate in your evaluation." Everyone turned to see Marcus Rivera entering the boardroom, followed by someone I didn't immediately recognize. Then I realized they were looking at me. That Marcus had just announced my identity as the founding donor to a room full of people who had spent years dismissing my contributions to the very program we were discussing. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Patricia's face cycled through confusion, realization, and something that looked like panic. Victoria's expression was harder to read, but I could see her rapidly calculating the implications of learning that the strategic donor she had been praising was the same person she had been systematically marginalizing. "Emma?" Patricia said finally, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. "You're the anonymous donor." "I am," I said, walking into the room with Marcus beside me. "I donated $25,000 5 years ago to establish this program, using money my grandmother left me when she passed away." Dr. Hartwell was watching this revelation with obvious interest, clearly recognizing that she was witnessing something more significant than a simple identity disclosure. "Ms. Chen," she said, "we're very pleased to meet you. Your gift has created something remarkable here." "Thank you," I said, taking the empty chair that Marcus had pulled out for me. Though I should clarify that the program's current form is quite different from what I originally envisioned. Quite different from what I originally envisioned. The words hung in the air like an accusation, though I had tried to keep my tone neutral. "Different how?" asked the program officer who had been taking notes throughout the meeting. I looked around the room, making eye contact with each person present. Patricia appeared to be holding her breath. Victoria was studying her hands. Robert, who had arrived for the reception and walked into the middle of this revelation, looked like he was trying to process information that didn't fit with his understanding of his family's philanthropic activities. "When I made the donation," I said, "my vision was for a program that would provide intensive, individualized music instruction to young people from low-income families. I wanted to create the kind of opportunities that had transformed my own life, taught by people who understood the challenges these students face." "That sounds exactly like what we've built," Victoria said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "It is what we built initially," I agreed, "but over the past 2 years, there's been a shift towards standardization and systematization that concerns me. The program is becoming more focused on scalability and metrics than on the individual relationships that make music education transformative." Dr. Hartwell leaned forward, clearly interested in this perspective. "Could you be more specific about those concerns?" "Certainly," I said, pulling out a folder of materials I had prepared for exactly this conversation. The original program emphasized small class sizes, with no more than 4 students per instructor. The current model has expanded to 8 students per class in order to serve more people with the same resources. "That's an efficiency improvement," Victoria said defensively. "We're able to reach twice as many students, but with half the individual attention," I countered. "Music education isn't a manufacturing process. You can't simply scale up production without affecting quality." The program officers were taking notes rapidly, clearly recognizing that they were hearing a fundamental disagreement about educational philosophy between the program's founder and its current leadership. "There's also the question of teacher qualifications," I continued. The original program required all instructors to have graduate-level training in music education and demonstrated experience working with students from diverse backgrounds. The current model has relaxed those requirements to include anyone with a music degree and basic teaching experience. "We've had to be more flexible about credentials," Patricia said, "in order to find enough qualified instructors for the expanded program. But that flexibility comes at the cost of instructional quality," I said. These students deserve teachers who understand not just music but the specific challenges they face as first-generation college students from low-income families. Dr. Hartwell was nodding thoughtfully. Ms. Chen, it sounds like you have strong feelings about maintaining the program's original educational approach. I do, I said. Because I was one of those students once. I understand what it means to have someone believe in your potential when no one else does. To receive the kind of intensive, personal instruction that changes not just your musical ability, but your entire sense of what's possible in your life. The room was completely silent now, everyone processing the implications of what I was saying. I was criticizing the program's current direction from a position of unquestionable authority. As someone who had both funded its creation and lived the experience it was designed to address. Ms. Chen, Dr. Hartwell said finally, would you be willing to work with our foundation to develop recommendations for maintaining the program's original educational philosophy while still achieving reasonable scale? I would be honored to do that, I said, though I could feel Victoria's stare burning into the side of my face. Excellent, Dr. Hartwell said. We'll want to include your perspective prominently in our evaluation report. The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises of follow-up conversations, but the real reckoning was just beginning. As the foundation representatives left for their next appointment, I found myself alone in the boardroom with Patricia, Victoria, and Robert. Emma, Patricia said, her voice carefully controlled, I think we need to discuss this situation. Do we? I asked. I'm not sure what there is to discuss. I made a donation 5 years ago, and now I'm participating in a grant evaluation. That seems fairly straightforward. What's not straightforward, Victoria said, her professional composure finally cracking, is your decision to withhold this information for so long. If we had known you were the founding donor, we could have worked with you more collaboratively on program development. Worked with me more collaboratively. Victoria was suggesting that my anonymity had been the problem, that if only she had known about my contribution, she would have been more inclusive of my perspective. Victoria, I said, I've been trying to work collaboratively with you for 2 years. Every suggestion I made about maintaining small class sizes was dismissed as impractical. Every concern I raised about teacher qualifications was characterized as resistance to strategic thinking. That's not how I remember those conversations, Victoria said defensively. Then you have selective memory, I replied. Because I distinctly remember being told that people with direct service backgrounds often have difficulty scaling up to strategic thinking. Victoria had the grace to look embarrassed. I may have been too focused on organizational efficiency. You were focused on taking credit for something you didn't build, I said, finally allowing my anger to show. You spent 2 years systematically marginalizing me while taking over every aspect of a program that existed. Because of my sacrifice. Emma, Robert said, speaking for the first time since the revelation. I had no idea you were the anonymous donor. Why didn't you tell me? I looked at my husband, this man who had sat through countless conversations about the program's success, without ever wondering whether his wife might have contributed to it in ways that weren't visible to his family. Would it have mattered? I asked. Would knowing that I had donated $25,000 have changed how your family treated my ideas about program development? Of course it would have, he said, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. Really? I said. Because last week at the gala, I overheard your mother and Victoria discussing my motivations for being involved in philanthropic work. Apparently, I'm a fortune hunter who's never made any significant financial contributions but who's always eager to be associated with your family's charitable activities. Patricia's face went pale. Emma, you weren't supposed to hear that conversation. No, I wasn't, I agreed. But I did hear it. And it was quite illuminating to learn that you consider me a social climber who doesn't understand how serious philanthropy works, while standing in a building where I had donated more money than most of your guests would contribute in their entire lifetimes. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Patricia was realizing that she had spent years dismissing the very person whose generosity had created her most celebrated philanthropic achievement. Victoria was understanding that her reputation as a strategic visionary was built on a foundation she had neither created nor acknowledged. I think, I said, standing to leave, that Dr. Hartwell will be very interested to learn about the disconnect between the program's founding vision and its current direction. I look forward to working with the Foundation to ensure that future funding supports the kind of intensive, individualized instruction that these students deserve. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to address the room one final time. By the way, I said, if you're wondering whether the anonymous donor will continue to support the program's development, the answer is yes. But my future contributions will be directed toward organizations that actually value my perspective rather than simply exploiting my resources. The drive home was a blur of adrenaline and relief. For 5 years, I had allowed myself to be marginalized and dismissed by people who had no idea what they were talking about. I had accepted their characterization of me as a dedicated volunteer rather than demanding recognition as a founding contributor. I had allowed my identity to be erased from my own philanthropic story. But that version of myself was gone now, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and was willing to claim credit for her contributions. The Foundation would learn about the philosophical disagreements between the program's founder and its current leadership. Patricia would have to explain how she had spent years taking credit for an initiative that had been funded by the daughter-in-law she had dismissed as a fortune hunter. Victoria would need to address questions about why the program's founding donor had concerns about its current direction. Robert would have to reconcile his understanding of his family's philanthropic legacy with the reality that their most celebrated achievement had been made possible by the woman they had systematically excluded from strategic conversations. 3 months later, I was sitting in my new office at the Hartwell Foundation, where I had been hired as a program officer specializing in community-based arts education. My job was to evaluate grant applications from organizations that wanted to replicate the youth music program model, ensuring that they understood the intensive, individualized approach that made such programs effective. The Opera House's grant application had been approved, but with conditions that reflected my recommendations about maintaining educational quality while achieving reasonable scale. Maximum class sizes were limited to 6 students per instructor. Teacher qualification requirements were strengthened to ensure graduate-level training in music education. Program evaluation would focus on individual student outcomes rather than just aggregate metrics. Victoria had resigned from her consulting firm after questions arose about her claims to have developed the strategic framework for successful arts education programs. Patricia had stepped down from her leadership role with the Metropolitan Arts Council, citing a desire to focus on direct service rather than organizational strategy. Robert and I had separated, not because of anger or resentment, but because we had realized that our relationship had been built on fundamental misunderstandings about who I was and what I was capable of contributing. He had married someone he thought of as a dedicated volunteer, while I had become someone who demanded recognition for strategic leadership. "Emma," came a voice from my office doorway. I looked up to see Dr. Hartwell, carrying a stack of grant applications that probably represented millions of dollars in potential arts education funding. "These organizations all want to replicate your model," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "But I'm not sure they understand what made the original program so effective." "Which is?" I asked, though I had my own ideas about what she was going to say. "The authenticity," she said. "The fact that it was created by someone who had lived the experience it was designed to address. Someone who understood from personal knowledge what these students needed and why it mattered." I nodded, thinking about my grandmother's inheritance and the decision I had made to honor her memory by creating opportunities for other young musicians. The money had been important, but the vision had been what made the program transformative. "That's what we'll be looking for in these applications," I said. "Programs that are designed by people who understand their communities, not just people who understand strategic philanthropy." Dr. Hartwell smiled. "I think you're going to be very good at this job." Later that evening, I was practicing piano in my apartment when my phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Rivera. "Thought you'd want to know," it read, "that we just received the largest anonymous donation in the Opera House's history. Someone who wanted to support intensive, individualized music instruction for young people from low-income families." I smiled, thinking about the foundation I had built and the legacy I was continuing to create. The anonymous donor who had been honored with an empty chair had stepped forward to claim credit for her vision. The fortune hunter, who had been dismissed for never making significant financial contributions, had revealed herself to be the program's founding benefactor. The dedicated volunteer, who had been marginalized as lacking strategic perspective, had become a program officer at one of the country's most respected philanthropic foundations. And the woman who had been told she didn't understand how serious philanthropy worked was now determining which organizations would receive funding to replicate the model she had created. Sometimes the quietest person in the room, the one everyone assumes doesn't belong, the one whose contributions are dismissed and whose motivations are questioned, sometimes that person is the one who actually built everything worth celebrating. Sometimes the woman who's been made invisible holds all the power, and when she finally decides to use it, the whole world shifts to accommodate her vision. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.